Okay, so this is my video for the lesson 5 alternative assignment, and I chose to watch the two YouTube videos as opposed to a TED Talk. And then I'll go on to reframe the statement that's given in question 2 of the thought questions. Yeah, I thought the YouTube videos were really well done on effective communication and the 4 phases of successful conversation, especially as they relate to kind of difficult conversations that pertain to conflict. And the first thing that stuck out to me in the first video was the idea of using nonverbal cues to kind of affirm what you're saying, and that could be, and also while you're listening to that, they go on to talk about that as well. And I found that that's something I don't do particularly well. I just don't know that I'm that aware of it. But to kind of have like a positive or open body posture while you're trying to convey a positive message and not scowl or roll your eyes or anything like that, and not to fold your arms or whatever the case may be. I think that's really helpful in kind of reaffirming what it is that you're saying to that person, because a lot of communication is nonverbal. So like people, like I said, like I'm not very good at giving off nonverbal cues in the right way, but I can read them really well, and I'm sure a lot of other people identify with that. So it's important to affirm what you're saying with your backing it up with kind of your body language and your nonverbal cues. So I thought that was really helpful to start with. And then I really like the point as well in overgeneralizing, because that can be really problematic, especially in conversations that involve conflict, because using hyperbole or statements involving like always or never really puts people on the back foot, I think. And like anytime that someone feels defensive in a conflict, it really can only be exacerbated from there, because they feel like they have to, play on the defensive and then, counterattack, etc. And then the fourth point that she made, the lecturer made, was something that has been huge for me to learn in my early 20s. And it's the idea of speaking for yourself and kind of speaking from personal experience. I think that there's a lot to be said for that, in terms of, you know, it's really easy to pick out what's wrong with other people or take other people's inventory, so to speak. But if I can speak from my perspective on it, and like, hey, this is the way that I feel about this, or like, hey, my experience is that if I'm late, I'm not as productive, or whatever it is. I mean, just sharing experience with someone else, they're much more receptive to that in my experience. And so I thought that was a good point that the lecturer made. And then just really quickly, glazing over the listening portion of that video, the point that stuck out to me there was not to start a counter argument in your head while the other person is speaking, because I can be really guilty of that, especially if something's kind of heating up a little bit. I can catch myself not even listening to what the other person's saying while I'm kind of crafting a counter argument, or like an attack, or whatever the case is. And then moving on to the 4 phases of difficult or successful conversation, I thought the format that she gave was really, really good. And she starts with the build up, which is where you recognize what the problem is and the patterns of it, and you start to build a case, which I think that term's a little bit can be potentially problematic, because you don't want it to be like building a legal case against them, because that's kind of accusatory or whatever. But I think that just kind of getting some base points for where you want the conversation to go is important. And then that kind of leads into the reflection part, where you get to identify kind of what it is about the issue at hand that affects you and why it does, because I think that it's really important to have a comprehensive understanding of that before diving into a conversation with someone about that. And that really helps with keeping the focus on yourself and not projecting onto the other person. And then, just an interdependent conversation is really important too, where you're talking about kind of identified shared goals, and looking at the conflict resolution as kind of a team activity, kind of, so to speak, or like a team thing where you're trying to arrive at the same point, as opposed to kind of butting heads and potentially pulling even further away or going in the opposite direction. um, more emphatically. And then the follow through also involves some kind of interdependence where you're holding each other accountable and you're making sure that, you know, you're both happy with the way that things are turning out as a result of that conversation. So just looking at thought question 2, where it says, if we don't get moving on this matter, we are likely to die of old age. Yeah, I think especially the second part of that. Just this goes back a little bit to overgeneralization or sarcasm. And, you know, anytime where there's a conflict, there's going to be a little bit of tension. And anytime that you make a remark like that that's sarcastic and hyperbolic, it's gonna, at least in my experience, it's gonna cause some problems. So what I would say is, I'd like to address this matter with you now so that it no longer exists as a barrier or cause of constraint in our relationship. And I think that still puts a bit of a time constraint on it, but it also takes away like the snide remark about, you know, the dying of old age thing, because for a number of reasons that puts the other person again on the back foot, and that's something that you don't want to do if you're having a kind of interactive dialogue and wanting to resolve the situation amicably. So that's what I would do on that, and those are the reasons why.